On Children's Day, a lonely millionaire was walking through the deserted square when a quiet sob caught his attention. Following the sound, he found a 7-year-old girl desperately searching through a trash can, her tears falling onto the cold ground. As he came closer and asked what was wrong, she lifted her sad eyes and whispered, "Sir, my stomach hurts so much from hunger." His heart broke, but when he asked her name, her simple and innocent answer nearly made him fall backward. Arthur Blackwood watched the world from the summit of his empire of glass and steel. Down below, in the park that stretched out like a green carpet amid the concrete, the colors of a weekend fall festival for kids exploded in balloons, laughter, and the scampering of children. Every shriek of joy that rose to the silence of his office was like a fine needle piercing his chest, a constant reminder of the void that money couldn't fill. At 45, he had achieved everything a man could desire: respect in the business world, an incalculable fortune, and the power to shape the city's skyline. Yet, in his heart, a desolate silence reigned. Guilt was his most faithful companion, a shadow that followed him from sunrise to sunset, whispering about the choices that had brought him here, alone. The obsessive dedication to his work, which everyone admired as his greatest virtue, was, in truth, his penance. A way to flee from the memory of a smile he had traded for spreadsheets and a hand he had let go of to grasp contracts. His eyes fixed on a father lifting his young daughter into the air, the sound of the girl's laughter reaching him, distorted by the glass and the distance. The scene transported him back 7 years to an argument that would change his life forever. The voice of Helena, his wife at the time, echoed in his mind, not with anger, but with a resigned sadness that wounded more than any shout. "Like you're building an empire, Arthur, but you're leaving our home in ruins." She was pregnant, a miracle they had waited for so long, and all he could do was plan the next merger, the next business trip. The night they chose the name came back to him. Sitting on the floor of the nursery, surrounded by paint samples, he had traced the letters in the air with his finger. "If it's a girl," he'd said, with a tenderness that now seemed to belong to another man, "her name will be Sophia." Helena had smiled, and in that moment, the world had seemed perfect. But perfection was fragile, and he had shattered it. The divorce was swift and painful, and with it came the silence. Helena disappeared, taking the promise of Sophia with her. He never heard from her, or the child again. The doubt gnawed at him day and night. Was there, somewhere, a 7-year-old girl with his eyes? The anguish became unbearable. The office, usually his sanctuary, now felt like a gilded cage. He needed air. Leaving behind the panoramic view and the untouched scotch on his desk, he descended the 40 floors and walked toward the park. The night was cold, and the wind cut at his face, but the chill was welcome, a distraction from the internal pain. The families had already gone home, and the park was now nearly deserted. Sprinkled with the remnants of celebrations, a deflated balloon caught on a bench, colorful streamers dancing in the wind. He was walking aimlessly, the sound of his expensive shoes echoing on the empty pavement, when a different sound cut through the silence. A cry. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but a low, restrained sob, almost swallowed by the night. It was the sound of a deep sadness, one that came from a place of exhaustion. Arthur stopped, his heart pounding erratically. The sound drew him in like a magnet. He followed the sobs to a darker area of the park, near a row of large metal dumpsters that served the neighborhood's luxury restaurants. And then he saw her, a small figure, huddled beside one of the dumpsters, her shoulders shaking with each sob. It was a little girl. Her small, dirty hands were carefully sifting through the contents. Her tears fell on scraps of cardboard, glinting in the faint light of a distant lamppost. The millionaire felt the air leave his lungs, a wave of something he couldn't name, compassion, horror, recognition, paralyzing him. He took a step forward, the crunch of his shoe on a dry leaf, making the child flinch like a startled animal. She turned, and her eyes, large and tear-filled, met his. In that instant, Arthur Blackwood's world stopped spinning. He was facing the purest, most innocent form of despair, and something inside him, something he thought was dead and buried, broke irreparably. For a long moment Arthur remained motionless, the sound of the girl's weeping echoing in the emptiness of his chest. The scene before him seemed like a nightmare painted with the grim colors of reality. The frail child, the thin, worn clothes that barely protected her from the cold, the dignity with which she tried to hide her tear-streaked face. Every detail was a silent accusation against his life of luxury and indifference. He, who moved markets with a phone call, felt powerless before this tiny, immense pain. With his heart hammering against his ribs, he finally forced his feet to move, approaching slowly with the care of one nearing a wounded bird. He knelt, ignoring the expensive fabric of his trousers soiling on the damp pavement, so his eyes would be level with hers. The proximity revealed just how small she was, with wet eyelashes stuck to her cheeks and a tremor that was not just from the cold, but from fear. "Hello," he said, his voice, usually firm and commanding in boardrooms, coming out as a hoarse, uncertain whisper. "Are you okay? Why are you crying?" The girl took a step back, her wide, frightened eyes fixed on him. She hugged herself, a gesture of self-protection that broke Arthur's heart. For a moment, she didn't answer, just studied him with a seriousness that didn't belong to a child. Finally, in a voice choked with tears, she answered, and her words were the simplest and most devastating he had ever heard. "My tummy hurts," she murmured, her small hand instinctively going to her stomach. "It hurts a lot, and from being hungry." The confession was stated without self-pity, like a simple fact, which made it all the more painful. For Arthur, it was like a punch to the gut. He, who had just left a business dinner where expensive dishes were left half-eaten, now faced a child whose physical pain was hunger. The guilt, once a shadow, now materialized, heavy and suffocating. "I can help," he offered, his voice still trembling. "There's a place nearby that serves hot chocolate and a really big sandwich. What do you think? I can buy it for you." He expected immediate acceptance, perhaps even a flicker of relief in her eyes. Instead, suspicion deepened her gaze. She hugged her arms tighter, her chin trembling. "My mom told me not to talk to strangers," she whispered, the words a fragile shield against the world. "She said that sometimes people make promises and then they just leave." The bitter wisdom in her childish voice was a testament to disappointments no child should ever know. Arthur understood. It wasn't just food she needed, it was safety, trust. He couldn't fail her. "Your mom is right," he agreed, keeping his tone gentle. "She's very smart, but I promise I'm not going anywhere. I just want to make sure your tummy stops hurting. We can sit somewhere you can see me the whole time. How about that?" He held out his hand, not to touch her, but as a gesture of peace, of invitation. "My name is Arthur. What's yours?" The girl hesitated, her gaze shifting between his outstretched hand and his face. She seemed to be fighting an internal battle, fear warring with desperate hunger. Slowly, as if the word were a weight on her tongue, she answered. The sound was almost inaudible, carried away by the cold night wind, but to Arthur it echoed like a thunderclap that split his soul in two. Sophia. The name hit him like a shockwave, stealing the air from his lungs and making the ground feel unstable beneath his feet. Sophia, the name he and Helena had chosen, the name that haunted his dreams. The world around him disappeared, the city lights, the distant sounds, the cold of the night. All that existed was this small, frightened girl who carried the name of his greatest loss, of his deepest regret. For a second he thought he might collapse right there. The coincidence was too cruel, too impossible. Unless it wasn't a coincidence at all. A dizzying, terrifying hope began to sprout in his chest, a hope he didn't dare to nurture, but which was already taking root. He had to know more. He had to understand. With his heart in a maelstrom of conflicting emotions, he forced himself to find his voice. Sophia, he repeated, the name sounding foreign on his own lips. That's a beautiful name. Sophia, please let me help you. Her name, Sophia, hung in the cold air between them, heavy with a weight the girl couldn't possibly comprehend. For Arthur, it was as if the past had materialized before him, embodied in that small, trembling figure. He fought to maintain his composure, to hide the storm of emotions that was shaking him. Desperate hope and paralyzing fear waged a war inside him. But one thing was clear: he could not leave this child alone. Not now. With a monumental effort, he pushed the shock to the back of his mind and focused on the present, on the girl's immediate need. The 24-hour diner was just 2 blocks away, an oasis of light and warmth in the dark night. He managed to convince her, not with words, but with the sincerity in his eyes. She finally agreed, but on one condition: she would walk a step ahead of him, where she could see him, but still out of his reach. Arthur agreed without hesitation. Every step of that short walk was torture. He watched Sophia's small, hunched back, the way she shrank into her thin jacket, and every detail heightened the feeling that the universe was either playing a cruel trick on him or offering him a chance at redemption. As they entered the diner, the warmth and smell of fresh food enveloped them. Arthur chose a booth in the corner, away from the few late-night patrons. Sophia sat on the edge of her seat, her feet barely reaching the floor, her wide eyes scanning the room with a mixture of wonder and apprehension. When the waitress approached, Sophia shrank back, hiding behind the menu as if afraid of being seen. Arthur ordered a plate of spaghetti and meatballs, a thick hot chocolate, and a side of fries. He watched, his heart aching, as she devoured the food. There was no childish haste, but a quiet, methodical urgency, as if she feared the plate might be taken from her at any moment. She ate with a focus that spoke of days, perhaps weeks, of deprivation. He said nothing, just observed her, noticing the small details, the way her eyes widened slightly at the first taste of the hot chocolate, a small sigh of contentment that escaped her lips. Seeing the tension in her shoulders gradually ease was more gratifying to Arthur than closing any multi-million-dollar deal. Once the sharpest pangs of hunger were sated, Sophia began to relax. She drank the rest of her hot chocolate more slowly, holding the mug with both hands as if to absorb its warmth. Arthur felt this was the moment to try and understand. His motivation was a complex web of feelings. Guilt compelled him to help, hope made him want to know the truth, and fear warned him not to get hurt. Not to build expectations around what could be just a painful coincidence. "Does your mom know you're out here?" he asked, his tone carefully casual. Sophia shook her head, her gaze suddenly somber. "She's not feeling well. She sleeps a lot." The simplicity of her answer hid a depth of worry. Arthur felt a chill, a child looking for food in a dumpster because her mother was sick. The image was devastating. "Is she very sick?" he pressed gently. Sophia shrugged, a small, helpless gesture. "She gets tired, and she coughs a lot. The doctor said she can't work anymore, or it'll get worse." She paused, pushing a stray French fry around her plate. "She used to clean a big place, full of windows, but she can't now." The casual mention of her mother's job made Arthur's heart stumble. A big place, full of windows, like his office building, like countless other commercial towers in the city. He pushed the thought away, telling himself it was just another coincidence. It couldn't be. "And where do you two live, Sophia?" he asked, his voice lower than he intended. She looked out the diner window, toward the dark hills that rose at the city's edge, where the lights were few and far between. "Up there," she said, pointing with her chin, "on Prospect Ridge. Our house is made of wood, and the roof makes noise when it rains." Prospect Ridge. Arthur knew the name. It was one of the city's largest neglected communities, a place often mentioned in the news for its precarious living conditions, for the daily struggle of its residents. The image of his ex-wife, Helena, always so elegant and proud, living in a wooden shack, was inconceivable. Yet the seed of doubt was already planted, and now it began to sprout, growing into a terrifying plant of possibilities. The girl, the mother's illness, the place they lived. The pieces were starting to connect in a terrible way. He had to help, but how? Offering money seemed simplistic, almost an insult to the complexity of the situation. This girl, Sophia, already displayed a wariness that money couldn't buy. She needed something he barely knew how to give, something he had denied himself and Helena for years: emotional involvement, presence, care. And that terrified him. Looking into those serious, weary eyes, Arthur realized the scale of the obstacle before him. He couldn't just write a check and walk away. If he truly wanted to help, he would have to cross a border within himself, a border he had fortified with walls of work and regret. And he didn't know if he had the courage to do it. In the days that followed, Arthur found himself living a double life. By day, he was the ruthless tycoon, presiding over meetings, analyzing charts, and making decisions that affected thousands. But at night, he transformed. He would leave his expensive suit in the office, change into discreet clothes, and drive his unassuming car, one he kept to avoid attention, to the park where he had found Sophia. He didn't dare go to Prospect Ridge yet. Her resistance and his own uncertainty held him back. Instead, he waited for her, his heart anxious, on the same bench every evening. The first night after their dinner, he feared she wouldn't show. The fear that it had all been a fever dream, or that she had been frightened by his intensity, consumed him. But right on time, as the evening grew cold, he saw her emerge from the shadows, hesitant, but there. Overwhelming relief washed over him. He brought food, always something warm and nourishing. They sat in silence at first, eating in a strange complicity. Arthur learned not to ask too many questions, to let her speak when she felt comfortable. And slowly, like a flower timidly opening to the sun, Sophia began to trust him. She started to talk, not about the great pains, but about the small things that made up her world. She spoke of the public school teacher who praised her drawings, of a stray cat she fed with the scraps she found, and of how she loved the smell of rain on the dirt. Every little detail she shared was a gift that Arthur treasured with reverent care. He listened, fascinated and heartbroken, to the resilience and purity that emanated from this child the world had tried to break. One evening, as they shared a slice of chocolate cake, she spoke about her mother in more detail. "Mommy cries when she thinks I'm asleep," Sophia said, her voice low, almost a secret. "She tries to hide it, but I hear the pillow get wet. She says everything will be okay, but her voice shakes." The image of Helena, the strong, vibrant woman he had known, crying alone in the darkness of a shack, was a knife twisting in his chest with every word from Sophia. "She misses working," the girl continued. "She liked making everything shine. She said a clean place makes people feel happier." Arthur swallowed hard, his throat tight. He remembered the pride Helena took in their home, how she cared for every detail with love. "And does she ever talk about my dad?" Arthur ventured to ask, his heart pounding against his ribs. He tried to keep his voice neutral, but he felt his entire soul was riding on that question. Sophia stopped eating and looked off into the distance at the city lights. "She says he was a traveler, that he came from far away and had to leave for another place, even farther away. She says he was a good man, but he had a different map than ours." The childish metaphor, undoubtedly crafted by Helena to protect her daughter, was both poetic and painful. A different map, that was exactly it. He had chosen a map that led him to skyscrapers and boardrooms, while theirs had led them to survival on Prospect Ridge. Then, Sophia added something that made Arthur's blood run cold. Sometimes when she has a fever, she talks in her sleep. She whispers a name, not the traveler's. It's a different name. The girl frowned, trying to remember. I think it's Arthur. She says Arthur really softly, like she misses him. Arthur's world stopped. It was no longer a coincidence. It couldn't be. The girl's name, the mother's illness, the cleaning job, and now his own name whispered in a feverish sleep. The puzzle pieces were locking into place with terrifying precision, forming a picture of his own neglect, of his colossal failure as a human being. The hope and fear that had been consuming him now merged into an overwhelming certainty. This girl was his daughter. And the sick woman crying in a shack was Helena, the love of his life, the woman he had abandoned. The revelation brought no relief, only a wave of panic and pain, so intense he had to grip the bench to keep from falling. He had found his family, but he had found them in a state of desperation that he himself had indirectly caused. The obstacle now was not discovering the truth, but how to face it. How could he look Helena in the eye after so many years? How could he explain to Sophia that he wasn't a traveler from a distant map, but a man who had been right here all along, just a few miles away, living in luxury while they fought to survive? The guilt was an abyss, and he was standing on the edge, about to be consumed by it. The certainty was a burning ember in Arthur's chest. Every night, as he said goodbye to Sophia, he felt a lump in his throat, a desperate urge to hug her and tell her the truth. But fear paralyzed him. Fear of her rejection, fear of the confrontation with Helena, fear of not being the father this girl deserved. He knew he could no longer postpone the inevitable. Helena's health, as described in the fragments of his conversations with Sophia, seemed to be deteriorating. He had to act, and fast. The third week since their meeting in the park began with a cold, frightened determination. He had spent the entire weekend planning, rehearsing conversations in his mind, imagining scenarios, all of them ending in disaster. But inaction was a luxury he could no longer afford. That Monday evening, when he met Sophia, he brought not just food, but a request. "Sophia," he began, his voice more serious than usual, "I'm very worried about your mom. I know some very good doctors. Maybe I could talk to her, see if I can help." The girl looked at him with her big, perceptive eyes. The trust she had placed in him over the past 2 weeks was being put to the test. "She doesn't like visitors," she replied, hesitation clear in her voice. "She's embarrassed of our house." Those simple words were like a blow to Arthur. Embarrassed. Helena, always so full of life and pride, was now ashamed of her home, of her life. "Please, Sophia," he insisted, urgency bleeding into his tone. "It's not about the house, it's about her. I need to know she's okay. Take me to her." Perhaps she saw the genuine agony in his face, or perhaps her worry for her mother overcame her caution. After a long pause, she finally agreed, with a nearly imperceptible nod. The journey to Prospect Ridge was silent and tense. Arthur drove his discreet car to the foot of the hill, where paved streets gave way to dirt lanes. They continued on foot, climbing narrow, poorly lit paths between makeshift houses that seemed to balance on top of one another. The air was thick with the smells of communal life, food cooking, dampness, wood smoke. To Arthur, it was like entering a parallel universe, a world of hardship he only ever saw through the window of his armored car or on television screens. Sophia guided him with the confidence of someone who knew every stone and every turn of this labyrinth. Finally, she stopped in front of a small wooden shack with a patched tin roof. A single weak bulb hung outside, casting a trembling yellowish light on a door that seemed too flimsy to protect anything. Arthur's heart was beating uncontrollably. He was seconds away from confronting his past, seconds from facing the consequences of his choices. Sophia pushed the door, which opened with a painful creak, and went inside, calling softly, "Mommy, we have a visitor." Arthur followed, ducking to get through the low doorway. The interior was tiny, a single room that served as a bedroom, living room, and kitchen. Despite the evident poverty, everything was impeccably clean and organized. On a makeshift bed in one corner, a woman was lying, covered by a thin, faded blanket. She turned slowly at the sound of her daughter's voice, and the face that emerged from the gloom made Arthur's world collapse. It was Helena, but a version of her he barely recognized. The years of struggle and illness had etched lines of exhaustion and pain into her skin. She was thin, pale, and her eyes, once so bright and full of fire, were now sunken and dull, circled by dark shadows. She blinked, trying to focus on the man standing in her doorway, a dark silhouette against the night. "Who?" she began to say, her voice weak and raspy from coughing. Then the light from the dim bulb illuminated Arthur's face. Helena's eyes widened, first in disbelief, then in a profound shock that seemed to drain the last bit of color from her face. The recognition was instantaneous, a violent collision of past and present. The silence that fell in the small shack was deafening, heavy with the weight of 7 years of unsaid words, of unshared pain, of an abyss that had opened between them. Sophia looked from one to the other, confusion written on her small face, not understanding the electric current of emotion passing between her mother and the kind man from the park. For Arthur, seeing Helena like this, frail, sick, and living in this squalor while he thrived, was the most devastating condemnation of all. There was no excuse, no justification. He had found her, and the sight of her was the materialization of his worst failure. The reunion was a silent cataclysm. Arthur and Helena stared at each other across the small room, and 7 years of distance dissolved into a moment of raw, mutual pain. In her eyes, he saw a whirlwind of emotions. Initial shock giving way to an old hurt, surprise hardening into a bitter resentment. She sat up in bed, her frail body tensing, as if trying to build an armor of skin and bone. The faded blanket was pulled tighter against her chest, a useless shield against the avalanche of memories his presence brought. Her motivation, forged in the fire of necessity and wounded pride, was clear: to protect her daughter. To protect her from the truth, from the disappointment, from the shame of having a father who, in her eyes, had abandoned them for wealth and success. She had chosen to raise Sophia alone, facing hunger, illness, and despair, rather than admit that the man who left her was the same one whose name graced the covers of business magazines. "What are you doing here?" Helena's voice came out as sharp as broken glass, cutting through the heavy silence. There was no room for pleasantries. Every word was a barrier, a wall erected to keep him at a distance. Arthur felt his throat go dry. All the lines he had rehearsed vanished, useless against the reality of her accusing gaze. I found her," he stammered, his gaze shifting to Sophia, who was watching the scene with wide eyes, her confusion deepening. "I didn't know. Helena, I swear I didn't know." A bitter, mirthless laugh escaped Helena's lips. "Didn't know? The whole world knows where you are, Arthur. Your buildings scrape the sky. Your face is everywhere. The question was never where we were, but if you ever cared enough to look." The words hit him with the force of a physical blow. He deserved this. He deserved every ounce of her contempt. He looked around the shack, at the thin wooden walls, the few clean pots stacked on a crate, the single window covered with a piece of plastic. He was seeing the result of his absence, the price of his success. While he closed deals in climate-controlled rooms, she fought to keep their daughter warm under a tin roof. "Mommy, he's Mr. Arthur," Sophia said, her small voice trying to mediate the tension she didn't understand. "He gave me food. He's nice." Her daughter's innocence seemed to break something in Helena. Her shoulders slumped slightly, and the hardness in her eyes faltered, replaced by a deep, weary pain. "I know who he is, sweetheart," she said, her voice suddenly gentle as she addressed the girl. "Go outside for a little bit, okay? I need to talk to Arthur." Sophia hesitated, looking suspiciously at the two adults, but she obeyed. As soon as the door closed, Helena's vulnerability vanished, replaced by a cold fury. "Ah!" "How dare you?" she hissed, her voice low but laced with venom. "How dare you walk into my home, get close to my daughter, after 7 years of silence? You made your choice, Arthur. You chose your empire. We are not a part of it." "That's not true," he tried to argue, taking a step forward, but stopped when she flinched back. "Helena, I need to help. You're sick. Sophia, don't you say her name." She cut him off, her eyes flashing. "You don't have the right. She has a life. A poor one, yes. A hard one. But it's our life. I don't need your pity or your money. It was her pride keeping her upright, stopping her from crumbling. Her refusal was the first great obstacle. He realized he couldn't just force his help on her. He would have to break through the wall of hurt she had built around herself and Sophia. And to complicate everything, there was the girl herself. Sophia was confused. The tension between her mother and the man she saw as a generous friend was a riddle. Why was her mother, usually so gentle, treating the kind man with such hostility? This confusion was a ticking time bomb, a second obstacle that could explode at any moment, causing incalculable emotional damage to the child. Arthur began to understand the depth of the chasm. To reconnect with them, he would have to do more than offer financial aid. He would have to unravel the last 7 years to understand how Helena, an educated and resourceful woman, had ended up here. He would have to prove that his presence wasn't an act of fleeting charity, but a genuine, desperate desire to fix what he had broken. He looked at Helena's pale, determined face and knew that the hardest battle of his life wouldn't be fought in a boardroom, but right here, in this humble shack, against the ghosts of his own past. "I'm not leaving, Helena." Arthur's words were not a request, but a declaration. He stood his ground in the doorway, a rock against the tide of her resentment. "You can hate me, you can throw me out 1,000 times, but I will not leave you two alone in this situation. Not anymore." Helena tried to stand up to face him, to use her fury as a weapon, but a violent coughing fit seized her, forcing her to double over, her frail body shaking with the effort. The strength she projected was a facade, and the cracks were beginning to show. Seeing her like this, struggling for air, broke Arthur's paralysis. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, ignoring the warning glare in her eyes. "You need water," he said, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. He spotted a clay water filter on a small crate serving as a table and a glass cup beside it. As he filled the cup, his eyes were drawn to a small, neat pile of papers next to the filter. They were official-looking envelopes, bills stamped with red, past due notices, and on top, a folded sheet of notebook paper. It looked like the draft of a letter, Helena's elegant and familiar handwriting covering the page. Curiosity, mixed with a desperate need to understand, overwhelmed him. He shouldn't, but he couldn't help it. His eyes scanned the first few lines. It wasn't a letter to him. It was a plea for aid, addressed to a social assistance program. The words were formal, but the supplication behind them was raw. And then one sentence struck him like a bolt of lightning, tearing the ground from under his feet. "My medical condition prevents me from working, and the cost of medication consumes everything I have. It's not for me, I ask, but for my daughter. She is 7 years old, bright and full of light, and she deserves more than a mother too sick to guarantee her next meal." The glass of water trembled in his hand. There it was, in black and white, the irrefutable proof of the depth of their desperation. Helena wasn't just proud. She had tried. She had fought. She had asked for help through the proper channels. And somehow, the system had failed her. She had swallowed her pride for everyone but him. That piece of paper destroyed Arthur's last barrier of uncertainty. Guilt transformed into a cold fury and an unshakable resolve. A fury at himself for his ignorance. A resolve that this would end, here, tonight. He turned, his face a mask of pain and determination. He held the glass of water out to her, and she took it with trembling hands, avoiding his gaze. "Enough. Helena," he said, his voice low and heavy, with an authority she hadn't heard in years. "The performance is over. This isn't about pride or the past or our mistakes anymore. This is about your health. It's about Sophia's future. You are going to accept my help. That is not an offer, it is a fact." Helena drank the water, the liquid seeming to give her a spark of her old fire. "You can't just walk in here and—" she began, her voice still hoarse. "I can and I will," he cut her off. "I read the letter, Helena. I know you tried. Now it's my turn." The mention of the letter made her cringe as if she'd been struck. Her face twisted in a mixture of humiliation and rage. "You had no right," she gasped, trying to stand again, this time with a feverish energy, as if to snatch the proof of her vulnerability from his hands. "This is my life, my fight." She took a staggering step toward him. But the effort was too much. Another coughing fit, more violent than the last, bent her in two. It was a deep, rattling sound that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. She brought a hand to her mouth, her body convulsing. Arthur surged forward to support her, panic rising in his throat. When the coughing finally subsided, she pushed away from him, gasping for breath, her face pale and slick with a cold sweat. And then he saw it. In the hand she slowly lowered from her mouth, she held a white cloth handkerchief, and in the center of the pristine fabric, a vibrant red stain was spreading, a terrible, unmistakable sign that turned Arthur's despair into pure terror. The red stain on Helena's handkerchief was a screaming full stop to her resistance. The terror in Arthur's eyes mirrored the fear she herself had tried to suppress for months. In that instant, the walls of pride and resentment crumbled, swept away by the overwhelming wave of reality. Her illness was no longer an excuse for her weakness. It was an imminent threat to her life and, by extension, to Sophia's future. The battle of wills dissolved into a shared, silent urgency. Arthur acted with a speed and efficiency that came from years of commanding an empire. He didn't ask for permission. He just grabbed the thin blanket from the bed, wrapped it around Helena's trembling shoulders, and with a gentleness that surprised them both, guided her out of the shack. Sophia, who had been waiting in the nearby darkness, ran toward them, her small face a mask of panic as she saw her mother's expression and the stain on the handkerchief that Helena tried in vain to hide. "Mommy!" Sophia's cry was sharp, filled with a primal childish fear. "She's going to be okay, sweetheart," Arthur said, his voice firm, though his heart was in pieces. He looked at Sophia, and in that moment, she wasn't just a scared child, she was his daughter. A visceral, overwhelming responsibility took hold of him. "Your mum just needs to see a doctor. We're all going together." The descent down the hill was a blur. Arthur practically carried Helena, who could barely stand. Sophia clung to his other hand, her cold little fingers gripping his tightly. They were a broken, makeshift family, united by fear, descending from the darkness into the uncertain light of the city. He took them directly to the best private hospital in the city, a place whose doors were normally impenetrable to people like Helena and Sophia. The contrast was brutal. They left the raw poverty of Prospect Ridge and entered a lobby of marble, sterile and silent. Nurses and security guards stared oddly at the trio. The man in designer clothes, the pale, sick woman in a faded blanket, and the little girl with worn clothes and frightened eyes. But the name Arthur Blackwood opened every door. Within minutes, Helena was in an emergency room, surrounded by doctors, and Sophia was sitting beside Arthur in a private waiting room, holding a mug of hot chocolate a nurse had brought, but unable to drink. The next few hours crawled by. Arthur made dozens of calls, mobilizing his contacts, ensuring Helena received the top specialists. All the while, he sat beside Sophia, the silence between them heavy with unasked questions. He could see the confusion in her eyes. Who was this man who suddenly had so much power? Why was her mother, who had treated him with such anger, now being cared for by him? Sophia's head had to be spinning, and Arthur felt a pang of guilt for adding this layer of chaos to her already difficult life. "She's going to be okay, right?" Sophia asked, her voice a fragile whisper. Arthur pulled her into a hug, the first real hug between them. He felt her stiffen for a moment before she relaxed into his arms, her small body trembling with exhaustion and fear. "Yes, she is," he promised, the words sounding more like a prayer. "The doctors here are the best. They're going to take care of her." While he comforted the daughter he barely knew, Arthur launched a parallel investigation. Using his phone, he activated his most trusted team, requesting a complete report on Helena's life for the past 7 years. He needed to know everything: where she worked, where she lived, what happened to bring her to this point. It wasn't just curiosity, it was a need to understand the full extent of his own failure, to map the path of suffering she had walked alone. The information began to trickle in within hours, painting a grim picture. Helena had lost a good job as a receptionist when the first symptoms of her condition started to affect her performance. After that, she took cleaning jobs, each one more precarious as her health declined. She was evicted from 3 different apartments for being late on rent, moving to a smaller, cheaper place each time, until her only option was the shack on the hill. Every new detail was a stab to Arthur's heart. He discovered that several of the office buildings where she had worked as a cleaner belonged to companies he did business with. She had been so close, moving invisibly through his world of glass and steel, while he remained blind in his ivory tower. Her suffering hadn't been a distant event. It had happened on the fringes of his own universe, and he had never noticed. The subplot of his life, which he had ignored for so long, now revealed itself to be the main story, and he was the unwitting villain. Helena's diagnosis arrived the next morning, delivered by a doctor with a serious face and carefully chosen words. It was a rare autoimmune disease that attacked the lungs and other organs. It wasn't a death sentence, but a chronic, debilitating condition that without proper treatment was progressive. The treatment was expensive and required constant monitoring. The coughing and extreme fatigue were the visible symptoms of a silent battle her body had been fighting for years. Arthur heard every word, the medical jargon sounding like white noise as the reality of the situation crushed him. Helena had faced this alone, paying for appointments and medication with what little she earned until she had nothing left. His team's investigation revealed she had sold everything of value: the jewelry he had given her, the car, even furniture. All to buy another day, another week for Sophia. The scale of her sacrifice and resilience was overwhelming. He had not only abandoned her, but he had left her to fight an impossible war with no one by her side. With Helena stabilized and under the care of the medical team, Arthur's focus shifted to Sophia. The girl was exhausted, asleep in an armchair in the waiting room, her face still streaked with dried tears. He watched her sleep, her small chest rising and falling softly. The resemblance to Helena was striking, but there was something in her jawline, in the curve of her eyebrows, that was unmistakably his. The love he felt for her in that moment was fierce, protective, and tinged with a profound sadness for all the lost time. He knew he couldn't just take her to his luxury penthouse. The transition would be too jarring, and he didn't want her to feel like a prize he had won. He needed help. That's when he thought of Clara, his younger sister. Clara was his opposite, warm, empathetic, a visual arts teacher who valued people over possessions. They had grown distant in recent years, partly because of her disapproval of his obsessive lifestyle and his divorce from Helena. But if there was anyone in the world who could understand and help, it was her. He called, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep and the weight of emotion. In less than an hour, Clara was at the hospital. She looked at Arthur, then at the sleeping girl, and her face softened with immediate understanding. He didn't have to explain much. The story was there, in the exhaustion on his face and in the presence of this child. "It's her, isn't it?" Clara whispered, her eyes welling up. "It's Sophia." Arthur could only nod, unable to speak. Clara came over and hugged him, a gesture of forgiveness and support he hadn't known he so desperately needed. "Bring her to my place, Arthur," she said. "My apartment is small, but it's a home. It'll be better for her than—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. Better than his sterile, lonely world. The fourth week began with a new, fragile dynamic. Helena was in the hospital starting treatment. Sophia was temporarily living with Clara in a cozy apartment filled with books, canvases, and the smell of paint. Arthur divided his time between the two locations. He spent part of the day at the hospital, sitting by Helena's bed, often in silence. Her anger had dissipated, replaced by a deep exhaustion and a vulnerable resignation. They began to talk, not about the past, but about the present, about the treatment, the doctors, about Sophia. They were hesitant conversations, like two strangers learning to dance together, afraid of stepping on each other's toes. In the evenings, he would go to Clara's. He'd have dinner with his sister and his daughter, trying to build bridges across a 7-year chasm. Sophia was adapting with the resilience of a child, charmed by the aunt who taught her to paint and by the abundance of food in the refrigerator. But she still watched him with a cautious curiosity. To her, he was still Mr. Arthur, the kind but mysterious man who had turned her world upside down. The truth of his identity hung in the air, a heavy cloud waiting to burst. They knew they had to tell her, but how? How do you explain 7 years of absence? How do you ask her to accept you as her father? The most difficult obstacle was about to emerge, and it wouldn't come from Helena, but from Sophia herself. One night, Arthur arrived at Clara's apartment a little early. The door was ajar, and he heard the voices of his sister and Helena, who was on speakerphone from the hospital. He stopped in the hallway, not wanting to interrupt. They were talking about him. "He's trying, Clara, he really is," Helena was saying, her voice stronger than it had been in days. "But I don't know how we're going to tell her. Sophia is so attached to the traveler dad story. How can we tell her that her father was here the whole time and never looked for her?" Arthur felt his heart freeze. Before Clara could reply, he saw movement out of the corner of his eye. Sophia was standing in the doorway of her room, just a few feet from the phone, her face pale, her eyes fixed on the source of the voices. She had heard everything. The silence that followed was broken by a single sob, a sound of betrayal and pain that hit Arthur with the force of a bullet. Sophia's sob was the detonator of a silent explosion. The world seemed to shift into slow motion. Clara turned, her face contorting in despair as she saw her niece standing there. Helena, on the other end of the line, must have sensed the change in atmosphere as her voice called out, "Clara, what happened?" But no one answered. All eyes were on Sophia. The little girl looked from Clara to Arthur, who remained frozen in the hallway, and her face, once confused, now crystallized with painful understanding. The pieces were clicking into place in her child's mind, not logically but emotionally. The kind man, the traveling dad, the whispered conversations, the tension between the adults. It all fused into a single, overwhelming truth. She had been lied to. Her lips trembled, and she took a step back, retreating into the safety of her room. There was no tantrum, no screaming. Her reaction was far worse. It was a silent withdrawal, a shutting down. She looked directly at Arthur, and in her eyes, he didn't see the admiration that had begun to grow in recent weeks, but a deep, cutting disappointment. "You lied to me," she whispered, her voice fragile but loaded with an accusation that disarmed him completely. And then she turned, walked into her room, and gently closed the door. The click of the latch was the loudest, most final sound Arthur had ever heard. It was the sound of a door closing in his heart. What followed were the most difficult days of Arthur's life. Sophia refused to speak to him. She wasn't rude or aggressive. She simply ignored him, as if he were invisible. When he tried to approach, she would get up and move to another room. When he spoke, she wouldn't answer. The silent treatment, coming from this small creature he desperately wanted to protect, was a refined form of psychological torture. She would talk to Clara, she would talk to her mother on the phone, but to Arthur, she was a well of silence. Her innocent but brutal words, "You lied to me," echoed in his head. They were the plain truth. They had lied. Helena to protect her, he out of cowardice, and now they were paying the price. Sophia's rejection forced Arthur to confront the reality of his choices in a way that even Helena's condition had not. He realized it wasn't enough to provide, not enough to be physically present. He had broken her trust, the very foundation of any relationship, especially that of a father and daughter, and rebuilding it seemed a Herculean task. Perhaps an impossible one. The guilt he felt morphed into something deeper, a sense of unworthiness. Maybe he didn't deserve to be her father. Maybe it was too late. He continued to go to Clara's apartment every evening, even knowing he would be met with Sophia's cutting silence. He would sit at the dinner table, eating food he could barely swallow, while Clara tried to fill the void with strained conversation. He would watch Sophia draw, build things with blocks, living in her own little world from which he had been summarily banished. It was during one of these torturous evenings that he had a revelation. He couldn't force her forgiveness. He couldn't buy her love. The only thing he could do was be there, consistently, and show her, not with words but with actions, that he was no longer the man who had abandoned her. One day, he saw her getting frustrated with a particularly difficult puzzle. She sighed and was about to give up. Instead of trying to help or offer advice, Arthur simply got another puzzle and sat on the other side of the living room, working on his in silence. He didn't look at her, didn't say a word. He just stayed there, sharing the space and the activity, demanding nothing in return. Hours passed. He finished his, and she, after watching him out of the corner of her eye, returned to hers with renewed determination and finally snapped the last piece into place. She said nothing, but he felt a minuscule shift in the atmosphere. It was the first glimmer that his new strategy, one of patient, unwavering presence, might, just might, work. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Helena was slowly recovering. The news of Sophia's reaction had shaken her deeply. She felt guilty for creating the traveling dad story, a lie that, however well-intentioned, had caused this new pain. The situation forced them to unite in a new way. Arthur and Helena began to have long, honest phone conversations about their mistakes, about what to do next. For the first time, they weren't blaming each other, but working together as parents, focused on their daughter's emotional well-being. And it was in one of these conversations that Helena revealed the third and most impactful major twist. "Arthur," she said, her voice hesitant, "there's something you need to know about the divorce. It wasn't just your work." He waited, his heart tightening. "I found out about my illness right after we separated. The first diagnosis was terrifying. The doctors didn't give me much hope. I didn't look for you, not just out of pride, but because I wanted to spare you. I thought I was going to die, and I didn't want you and Sophia to have to go through that. I decided to disappear to protect you both from the pain." Helena's confession over the phone was like a shockwave, rearranging all the pieces of Arthur's past. The narrative he had constructed in his mind for 7 years, that he was the sole villain, the man who chose work over family, was suddenly revealed to be incomplete. Her decision wasn't just a reaction to his absence, it was a twisted act of sacrifice, born of fear and a protective love. She had pushed him away, not just in anger, but to spare him a suffering she believed was inevitable. The revelation didn't absolve him of his guilt. He was still the absent husband, the man who had created the environment where such a drastic decision seemed like her only option, but it added layers of complexity and tragedy to their story. He realized they had both been prisoners of their own assumptions and fears, building walls where they should have built bridges. The resentment he held for himself began to give way to a profound compassion for her, for the woman who faced a terrible diagnosis and single motherhood alone, believing she was doing the right thing. This new perspective changed the dynamic between them. Their conversations became deeper, more vulnerable. They cried together over the phone, mourning the lost years, the unsaid words, the misunderstandings that had led them down such divergent paths. For the first time, Arthur felt they were truly communicating, not as bitter ex-spouses, but as two flawed human beings trying to find their way back to each other, united by their unconditional love for their daughter. While his relationship with Helena was rebuilding on a foundation of painful honesty, the situation with Sophia remained stalled. His silent, constant presence at Clara's apartment was a daily test of his patience and his repentance. He would bring small gifts, a colored pencil in a shade she didn't have, a book about stars because he'd overheard her ask Clara about the moon, but he would leave them on her desk without expecting a thank you. He learned to communicate in silence, through gestures that said, "I am here, I am not going anywhere, I respect your space." Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Sophia's wall of ice began to show tiny cracks. One day, she saw him struggling to open a jar of jam and, without a word, fetched a cloth to help him get a better grip. On another occasion, he dropped a stack of papers, and she knelt to help him gather them. They were minuscule interactions, but to Arthur, they were worth more than any multi-million-dollar contract. They were signs that the girl, in her childish wisdom, was watching, evaluating, perhaps beginning to reconsider. The real turning point, however, came from an unexpected source. As the investigation into Helena's life continued, one of his assistants discovered something perplexing. Several cleaning staff who had worked over the years at his own company, Blackwood Industries, were from Prospect Ridge. Intrigued, Arthur had his assistant discreetly speak with some of them. The truth that emerged was both touching and frustrating. Many in the community knew Helena's story. They knew she was the ex-wife of the owner of the building. They knew about her illness and her struggle, but a code of silence and loyalty to her had stopped them from acting. They respected her too much to betray her trust, to humiliate her by exposing her situation to the man who had hurt her. They helped her as they could, with a plate of food, by watching Sophia for a few hours, but they never had the courage to cross the line and tell Arthur the truth. He had been in the same building as people who knew his deepest secret, separated from them by flaws and hierarchies. The subplot of his corporate life and the tragedy of his personal life had intersected in silence, in the same physical space, without him ever realizing it. The news hit him hard. He wasn't just blind, he had created a work environment so formal and distant that his own employees didn't feel comfortable bringing him a human issue, a matter of life and death. It was further proof of how his obsessive focus on work had insulated him from basic humanity, including the humanity that existed within his own walls. He looked out his office window, not at the park, but at his own reflection. The man staring back was a stranger, a king in an empty castle. And he knew with absolute clarity that something fundamental had to change, not just in his relationship with Helena and Sophia, but in the very essence of who he was. The 5th week began with an urgent call from the hospital. It was the middle of the night. Arthur answered on the first ring, his heart leaping into his throat. On the other end of the line, a doctor's voice was calm but firm. Helena had suffered a sudden complication, a severe respiratory crisis. Her body, weakened by years of fighting without proper treatment, was reacting unpredictably to the new medication. She was in the intensive care unit. The situation was critical. Arthur's world shrank to the sound of his own breathing and the buzz of the phone. The fragile hope he had been building for weeks threatened to shatter. He dressed mechanically, his mind racing. He called Clara, his voice a taut wire, explaining the situation. He had to get to the hospital. He needed her to stay with Sophia. But as he was about to leave, a small figure appeared in the dark hallway of Clara's apartment, where he'd been staying to be closer. Sophia stood there, her pajamas rumpled and her eyes puffy with sleep. "I heard the phone," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "It's Mummy, isn't it?" Arthur knelt in front of her, his face etched with worry. "Yes, sweetheart, she's not feeling very well. I have to go to the hospital." He expected her to cry, to ask to stay with Aunt Clara. Instead, Sophia surprised him. She took a step forward, and the determination on her small face was an echo of Helena's strength. "I'm coming with you," she declared. It wasn't a request, it was a statement. "She's going to need me." In that moment, Arthur saw the depth of this little girl's love. She wasn't thinking of her own fear, but of her mother's need. He hesitated for only a second. Taking her into the tense atmosphere of an ICU was the last thing he wanted. But her gaze, firm and unwavering, convinced him. To deny her, this would be to treat her like a fragile child, and she had already proven to be so much stronger than that. "Okay," he agreed. "Go get dressed. Quickly." The ICU waiting room was a cold, impersonal place, painted in shades of pale grey and blue. Arthur and Sophia sat side by side, in a silence that was no longer one of estrangement, but of shared anguish. The hours dragged on, each minute stretched to its limit by uncertainty. Arthur tried to distract her with games and stories, but she seemed to sense the gravity of the situation, remaining quiet, her gaze fixed on the double doors through which doctors and nurses came and went. It was in this limbo of fear and hope that the emotional climax of their journey finally occurred. Sophia, who had been quiet for so long, turned to him. Her eyes, so like Helena's, were filled with a wisdom that went far beyond her 7 years. "Being mad at you isn't going to help, Mommy, is it?" she said, more a statement than a question. Arthur felt a lump form in his throat. He shook his head, unable to speak. "Aunt Clara told me that sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, big mistakes, because they're scared," she continued, her voice thoughtful. "Were you scared?" The direct, unvarnished question disarmed him. He looked into his daughter's eyes and decided she deserved nothing less than the absolute truth. "Yes," he confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "I was terrified, scared I wouldn't be a good dad, scared I would fail, and my fear made me make the biggest mistake of all, leaving." Sophia absorbed his words, her small face serious. "Mummy was scared too. That's why she made up the traveler. She didn't want me to be sad." She paused, and what she said next was the key that unlocked the final door to Arthur's heart. "I think you were both just trying to protect each other, and me. You just did it the wrong way." Gert, in that sterile waiting room, a 7-year-old girl had summed up the tragedy of their lives with a clarity and compassion that no adult had managed to find. She wasn't just forgiving, she was understanding. And in understanding, she was setting them free. In that moment, they stopped being the guilty man and the betrayed daughter. They became two people who loved the same woman, united in the hope for her recovery. Arthur pulled her into a hug, and this time she hugged him back tightly. He buried his face in her hair, the tears he had held back for years finally falling. Tears not of guilt, but of gratitude and a love so deep it ached. They didn't know what the future held for Helena, but there, in that embrace, father and daughter had finally found each other, and a family, broken by years of fear and misunderstanding, began to heal. Helena's crisis lasted for 48 hours, 2 days in which time seemed suspended for Arthur and Sophia. They took turns keeping a silent vigil outside the ICU, a small team united in their anxiety. Clara brought food and blankets, creating a small bubble of care amidst the hospital's sterile environment. During this time, Arthur's transformation solidified. He cancelled all his meetings, delegated responsibilities, and for the first time in his adult life, his business empire became distant background noise. His sole priority was the family he had almost lost. He learned the nurses' names. He spoke with the doctors not as a tycoon demanding results, but as a worried husband and father seeking to understand every detail. And he talked with Sophia. They talked about everything, about Helena, about her dreams, about the stars she loved to draw. He discovered that she was incredibly bright, curious, and possessed an empathy that left him in awe. The barrier between them had completely dissolved, replaced by a bond forged in the fire of this crisis. Finally, on the third day, the news came. Helena had stabilized, the crisis had passed. She was still weak, and the road to recovery would be long, but she was going to live. The relief was so intense that Arthur felt his knees buckle. He hugged Sophia tight, and the two of them cried together, this time with tears of pure joy. When they were finally allowed to see her, Helena was pale and surrounded by monitors, but her eyes were open and lucid. She looked at Arthur and Sophia, standing side by side, hand in hand at the foot of her bed. A small, tired, but genuine smile touched her lips. No words were needed to express what they all felt in that moment. They had weathered the storm together. In the weeks that followed, the resolution of their conflicts began to take concrete shape. Arthur's first victory was ensuring Helena had continuous access to the best treatment, not as a gift, but as a right. He wasn't just paying bills. He was present for every consultation, learning about the disease, becoming an active partner in her health journey. Facing his years of regret was no longer a paralyzing torture, but a motivation to do what was right, to make up for lost time with present action. His second and most important victory was the consolidation of his relationship with Sophia. Earning her trust didn't happen overnight, but through a series of small, consistent actions. He drove her to and from school, helped with her homework, listened intently to her stories about recess. The greatest proof of his change, however, came when he made a drastic decision in his professional life. He called a meeting with his company's board and announced he was stepping down as CEO. He would remain as chairman of the board in an advisory role, but he was handing over the day-to-day operations to his successor. The news shocked the business world, but to Arthur, it was the most logical choice in the world. He explained his decision to Sophia simply, I spent a lot of time building buildings, and now I want to spend all my time building a family. Seeing the proud smile on his daughter's face when she heard those words was the greatest bonus he had ever received. With Helena's health improving and his relationship with Sophia blossoming, the final step was to decide what their future as a family would look like. There was no easy path or magic solution. They were three people scarred by a painful past, learning to navigate a new present. The decision was not to get back together as a couple immediately, but to become partners in raising Sophia, allowing time for emotional healing to take place. Arthur bought a comfortable house in a quiet neighborhood, near a good school for Sophia, and with a garden, something Helena had always dreamed of. It wasn't an ostentatious mansion, but a home. Helena, upon her release from the hospital, moved in with Sophia. Arthur did not move in with them, but rented a small apartment nearby. He was there every day, for breakfast, for dinner, for family movie nights on the couch. But he gave Helena the space she needed to recover and find herself again, and gave himself the time to prove his change was permanent. Their mutual forgiveness was not a single event, but a daily process, built on patience, honesty, and the rediscovery of the love that, despite everything, had never completely died. 5 weeks after that cold autumn night, the world was an unrecognizable place for Arthur Blackwood. The luxury penthouse overlooking the city was empty, listed with a real estate agent. His name no longer graced the business columns with the same frequency, replaced by that of his successor. The empire of glass and steel he had built continued to thrive, but its founder was elsewhere, engaged in building something infinitely more valuable. On that Saturday afternoon, The spring sun streamed through the windows of the new house, illuminating the living room. It smelled of fresh paint, orange cake baking in the oven, and the damp earth of the newly planted garden. The scene was the picture of domestic tranquility, something Arthur once scorned as mundane and now considered the purest of luxuries. He was sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by the pieces of a toy castle, trying to decipher the instructions. Sophia was beside him, laughing at his confusion and pointing to the diagrams with the impeccable logic of a 7-year-old. "No, Dad, that tower goes here," she said, the word "Dad" falling from her lips with a naturalness that still made Arthur's heart swell with warmth. He was no longer Mr. Arthur or the traveler. He was simply Dad. Helena watched them from the sofa, wrapped in a soft blanket. The past few weeks had brought color back to her cheeks. The medication was working, and the absence of the constant stress of survival was working its own healing magic. She still had a long road ahead, but for the first time in years, the future felt not like a minefield of uncertainty, but a horizon of possibilities. She looked at Arthur, not the tycoon the world knew, but the man fumbling with toys on the floor, the man who woke up early to make breakfast, and who read stories to their daughter before bed, using funny voices for each character. She was falling in love again, not with the memory of the ambitious young man she had married, but with the mature, present man he had become. Arthur's transformation was the final victory. He had learned that true success wasn't measured on a balance sheet, but in the bonds of affection we weave. He discovered a capacity for love and selflessness he never knew he possessed, buried under layers of ambition and guilt. The little girl he had found rummaging through a dumpster, crying from hunger and loneliness, hadn't just been his salvation in the sense of giving him a family. She had been the catalyst for his own rediscovery. Sophia, with her innocence and unexpected wisdom, had taught him to see the world through new eyes, to value the small moments, and to understand that the greatest wealth is the time we give to those we love. Later that afternoon, as they finished building the castle, the doorbell rang. It was Clara, bringing a canvas and a set of paints as a gift for Sophia. The family gathered around the kitchen table, eating orange cake and laughing, the sound filling the house with a life that no expensive object could ever buy. Arthur looked at the faces of the 3 most important women in his life: Helena, his partner on the journey of healing and rediscovery; Clara, the anchor of common sense and affection; and Sophia, his heart, his compass, his miracle. The story that had begun with a desperate cry in the darkness of a park found its conclusion in the warm light of a home. The family had been rebuilt, not on the fragile foundations of money, but on the solid pillars of forgiveness, accepted responsibility, and an unconditional love that had proven strong enough to overcome 7 years of pain and distance. The child that fate had placed in his path was not a reminder of his failure, but the embodiment of his second chance. And Arthur Blackwood, the man who once had everything and nothing, finally understood that real life, a meaningful life, was just beginning.